I left my boyfriend because he earned too little at his job and had to work 5 days to take me out as I deserve. My new boyfriend always has money, since his parents always give him everything. I remember the exact sound of the boutique door as it closed behind us, that elegant click, as if the world of people with dignity had just expelled me. Santiago was pale, with the card in his hand as if it were a corpse, and me with an empty Gucci bag that felt heavier than a debt. The saleswoman smiled with that sharp kindness they use when you're no longer a customer. "You're a nuisance." I couldn't breathe, not out of drama, but because I felt like my basic right to abundance was being torn from me. And before you judge me, I'm going to explain why I reached this point. I know what people think when they hear I left Mateo for money, as if love has to be a scholarship for mediocrity. Mateo was a good guy, yes, one of those who believe that being good pays the emotional rent, but I wasn't born to be grateful for crumbs with a smile. With him, everything was an effort. An effort to go out, an effort to eat, an effort to not feel like I was being slowly pushed into a life of street tacos and splitting the check at the movies. I'm not a calculator, but I'm not a sentimental NGO either. And if anyone thinks that's not draining, it's because they've never had to measure their happiness in coins. I met Mateo when I was still in that innocent phase of believing that stability is built with details and not with solvency. He was attentive, he wrote me long messages, he asked me how I felt. He did that whole present boyfriend act that sounds lovely until the bill arrives. His plans were always the same: park, cheap ice cream, movie at home, a walk, a picnic with stuff from the supermarket. At first, I told myself it was romantic, that it was authentic, that true love doesn't need luxuries. But then I started to notice that he repeated that philosophy more when he couldn't pay and less when it was a choice. That's not humility anymore, that's a defense mechanism. The worst part is that Mateo was proud of his effort and used it as a moral argument for everything. If I mentioned a nice restaurant, he'd get serious and say he worked 5 days to take me out like I wanted, as if that were a heroic gesture and not a sign of incompatibility. He'd talk to me about goals, about saving, about patience, and I'd listen to him feeling like he was training me to resign myself. I didn't want to be the girlfriend who applauds a coffee as if it were a trip to Paris. I wanted to feel like my life was moving forward, not just surviving. Besides, with Mateo there was always the feeling that I was the one asking for too much. If I wanted a nice blouse, it was a whim. If I wanted an Uber at night, it was an exaggeration. If I wanted him to treat me without splitting the bill, I was being an opportunist. He dropped that word on me once, softly, almost accidentally, but it left a tattoo on my forehead. Opportunist. Why? For not being embarrassed, for not feeling like my partner is looking at the menu as if it were an enemy? I wasn't asking for diamonds, I was asking for dignity in the form of a plan. And that's when Santiago comes in, because life sometimes sends you comparisons that are disguised lessons. I met Santiago at a casual gathering, one of those where everyone seems to be living in a different movie. Santiago didn't talk about money as an obsession because for him, money was oxygen. It was just there, no discussion. He didn't say, "I can't," he said, "Which one do you like?" And he'd pull out a card as if it were an extension of his hand. And yes, his job was to exist, but that's a social role too. Rich people are born with a job. Being rich. I wasn't going to pretend that didn't matter. When Santiago asked me out for the first time, there was no stress, no calculations, no that look on Mateo's face while checking prices. It was a nice dinner, dessert, a taxi, and the feeling that I was finally where I belonged. I wasn't asking for too much, it was the world giving me the minimum I always knew I deserved. And most importantly, with Santiago, I didn't have to justify why I wanted things. He assumed I wanted things because, of course I did, and he didn't turn it into a moral judgment. Leaving Mateo was simple, even though people dramatize it. I looked at him one day while he was telling me we couldn't go out this month because he was on a tight budget, and I realized I was tired of being patient. I told him I needed a different life, that it wasn't personal, that it was an incompatibility, and he was left with that heroic victim face as if I were betraying him for not being a millionaire. I didn't insult him, I didn't humiliate him, I just chose myself. If that hurts people, that's their problem, not mine. A week later, I was already with Santiago, because when something feels right, you don't need to prolong the agony for protocol's sake. With Santiago, everything was easy. Trips, clothes, dinners, spontaneous plans, that feeling that every day could be better without having to negotiate with reality. I'd post photos, and for the first time I didn't have to hide the cheap background. I didn't have to pretend everything was homemade. I felt cared for, supported, validated. And yes, money validates, because money is action. Words are nice, but they don't pay for anything. The only thing I saw as a shadow was Dona Elena, Santiago's mother, who was one of those women who don't look at you, they evaluate you as if you were a risky investment. I met her at a family lunch, and from the moment she greeted me, she gave off that controlling energy, as if she were the owner not just of the house, but of my future. She spoke to Santiago in that motherly tone that doesn't raise, it manages. She corrected him, gave him orders disguised as advice, and he smiled like a child, obedient, grateful. At first, I told myself it was normal, that people with money are like that everything has rules, but I knew that lady had a button, and that button was the credit card. Santiago, for his part, lived as if money had no origin, as if the black card sprouted from the ground. His parents gave him everything. And that seemed perfect to me, because I wasn't asking him to kill himself working. I was asking him to live up to my life. If his parents wanted to finance him, that was their business. I wasn't going to get moralistic about it. In fact, I said it was a blessing, because what's the need to suffer if the universe has already provided a structure? The problem is that structure had an owner, Dona Elena. And then came the day of an aunt's birthday, an event that was irrelevant to me, because I'm a girlfriend, not a family calendar. Santiago didn't go because he was lazy, distracted, in his typical way of living without consequences. I didn't even think anything serious would happen, because really, how childish can a mother be with her adult son? Well, it turns out she can be dangerously childish. Dona Elena decided to turn off the tap, just like that, like someone turning off a light to punish. And instead of punishing Santiago, she punished us both, because of course she knows where it hurts. We found out in the middle of a Gucci store, as if life wanted the humiliation to have good lighting. Santiago was picking things without looking at prices, and I was in my element, because that's where you feel real, visible, important. When it was time to pay, the card didn't go through. Santiago laughed, thinking it was a mistake, a glitch. The saleswoman tried again, her smile hardening, and I started to feel the floor open up. Santiago called his bank, checked his phone, and his face changed like when a child's candy is taken away. I froze because there are humiliations that aren't financial, they're existential. It wasn't just, there's no money, it was, there's no support. That's when I understood that I wasn't with a rich man, I was with a son on a leash. And when Dona Elena reduced him to a zero balance, she reduced him in my head too. The empty bag, the silence, the eyes on us, and Santiago whispering that his mom was angry. Angry, as if I could live off someone else's anger. On the way back, I didn't cry from shame, I cried for survival. I told Santiago this wasn't a whim, that my emotional stability depended on not feeling abandoned, that I couldn't go back to Mateo's life, because that would kill me. And it's not a threat, it's reality. When security is taken from me, my body collapses, my mind shuts down. I don't function. I told him that if he really loved me, he had to face his witch of a mother and fix this, because he can live with a zero balance, but I can't, I wasn't born for that. Comments from the main story. Anonymous user 1 says, you say splitting the movie bill with Mateo was economic violence, but then you get with a guy whose job is to exist, and you have a crisis when the card doesn't work at Gucci. It's not that you deserve abundance, it's that you deserve a reality show. OP's reply. It's so easy to mock when you're not the one feeling your world collapse because of a controlling mother and a spineless boyfriend. I didn't ask for luxury for sport, I asked for stability. And if you find it funny that someone is left without support, that says more about your mental poverty than about me. Besides, what I had with Mateo wasn't love, it was precarity disguised as humility. I'm not obligated to applaud his mediocrity just so you can feel morally superior. Anonymous user I says, The best part is you say you didn't humiliate Mateo, but you describe him as if he were a sentimental beggar, and now you're blackmailing Santiago by saying you'll get depressed if he doesn't get money. You're literally a walking invoice with eyelashes. OP's reply. Oh, please, you make up phrases to feel clever and miss the point. I don't blackmail, I express my emotional limits, because if I collapse, nobody wins, not Santiago, not me, nobody. And the thing with Mateo isn't humiliation, it's a fact. He worked 5 days for one date, and that's no life for me. If you want to live counting coins and call it love, go ahead, but don't come imposing your standard on me as if it were universal law. Update 1. It's been 3 days since the last update, and they've been 3 days of pure anxiety, the kind that leaves your shoulders stiff and your head spinning as if you were in a room without air. Santiago said he was going to talk to his mother. He promised with that voice of a man who wants to sound like a man, but I could already see the scene coming. He doesn't know how to confront, he only knows how to spend. I saw him rehearsing in front of the mirror once like a child practicing asking for permission, and that's when I understood this wasn't going to be fixed with love, it was going to be fixed with strategy. The first day I went with him for support because if I left him alone he'd melt. We went to his parents' house and Dona Elena received us as if we were an administrative nuisance, not two people in crisis. Santiago tried to explain that forgetting about his aunt was an oversight, that he didn't mean to be disrespectful, that he'd been busy, and I felt my blood boil. Busy with what? He doesn't work. But I didn't say anything because I was sizing up Dona Elena, seeing how cruel she could be. Dona Elena listened to him with a chilling calm and then reminded him that money is not a right, it's a privilege earned with obedience. I swear that sentence made me sick, because nobody should condition their adult son's life as if he were a trained dog. Santiago lowered his gaze, apologized, and I saw his dignity shrink. I wanted to scream at him to defend himself, that she couldn't do this, but he started talking about learning, about maturing, about doing the right thing, as if he were suddenly a philosopher, when all he was doing was giving up. The second day came the news that finally broke my patience. Santiago agreed to work at the family company as an archivist for minimum wage, according to him, to learn the value of money. Archivist, minimum wage. I had to sit down because I felt a real dizziness, as if the universe were playing a cruel joke on me. In a second, I went from dinners and trips to a man filing papers for a salary that doesn't even cover my basic needs. And the worst part is that he said it proudly, as if it were a moral achievement, as if I had to applaud his descent. I looked at him and told him that was humiliating, that it was living like Mateo, that I hadn't changed my life to end up in the same poverty with a different name. Santiago got offended, said I was materialistic, that one had to be grateful, that his mother was trying to teach him, and that's when I saw the full extent of the poison. Dona Elena wasn't teaching, she was taming. And if she tamed him, she tamed us both. Because she was pushing me to accept less than I deserve. That night I didn't sleep because when you feel threatened, your mind becomes a machine. I started thinking about options, about ways out, about how to maintain what we had already experienced. I couldn't accept that abrupt change as if it were normal, because it wasn't normal, it was violence disguised as a lesson. Santiago had been raised with everything. His parents had accustomed him to a certain life, and now they wanted to punish him by cutting off his support as if that wouldn't destroy anyone. I thought, if you raised him like that, you take responsibility. You can't play strict mom when your son already has a reality. On the third day, Santiago came home tired from work, with dust-stained hands and a sad face that made me angry, because that sadness was defeat. He told me his dad put him to archive old documents and that a supervisor treated him like any other employee. He said it as if it were a story of overcoming adversity, but I heard the sound of our lifestyle crashing to the floor. In my head it was simple. If Dona Elena wants to punish, let her punish, but she shouldn't starve us emotionally. That's when I proposed what was, to me, a logical solution, not a crime. I told him there was more than enough money in that house, that there were things that wouldn't be missed, that the fair thing to do was to borrow something while he got his inheritance back. Santiago tensed up, said that was wrong, that it was stealing, and I looked at him with a cold patience. I explained that stealing is when you take from someone who needs it, but here we were talking about antique watches stored in a safe, heirlooms they used to show off, not to live on. Santiago hesitated because he's afraid of his mother, not because he has morals. I told him just that if he wanted to be a man, he had to stop asking for permission and start protecting what's ours. I reminded him of the humiliation at Gucci. I reminded him how people looked at us. I reminded him how the saleswoman treated us like trash. I told him my mental health couldn't take another fall, that I couldn't handle more shame, that if he didn't do something, I would break inside. And it's not manipulation, it's that I feel things strongly, and when I feel them strongly, I break. In the end, I convinced him because desperation is also a type of love, and Santiago wanted me to be okay. We went to his dad's safe with trembling hands, and I guided him because someone had to have clarity. Santiago took out some antique watches, beautiful, heavy, as if each one held a piece of his last name. I told him it was temporary, that we'd sell them, that we'd replace them later, that his parents owed us that for all the emotional damage. He was breathing as if he were going to faint, but he did it. And when the watches were in our bag, I felt for the first time in days that control was back in my hands. That night, while Santiago tried to justify it with phrases he didn't even believe, I kept telling myself this was justice. Because Donna Elena had no right to play with our lives over an aunt's birthday. And if her way of loving is to control with money, then money is also a weapon we can use. I didn't want a war, but if she started it, she was going to reap what she sowed. And although I tried to sleep, I had a strange feeling in my chest. Not guilt, but a premonition, as if the universe were watching and waiting for the next blow. Comments from the update. 1. Anonymous User 1 says, "What a gem. You call it a lesson for him to get minimum wage and justice to steal watches from a safe. On top of that, you sell it as a mental health issue because you were humiliated at Gucci, as if life owes you a black card by decree." OP's reply. Look, if you don't understand what it's like to fall hard because of a manipulative mother, I'm not surprised everything seems simple to you. It's not that the world owes me a card, it's that Santiago was raised with that life, and it's not fair for them to punish him like a criminal for missing a birthday. And yes, my mental health matters because when I collapse, everything collapses, but you people love to see a woman suffer to feel righteous. The watches were a temporary measure, not a criminal career as you paint it. Anonymous User 2 says, "You say Mateo was poverty and now it's disgusting that Santiago earns less than him, but your grand plan is to turn him into a thief to maintain your lifestyle. You don't need a boyfriend, you need a sponsor and a therapist." OP's reply. What an obsession with Mateo. As if I have to live chained to a past just so you can be at peace. Santiago is not a thief. Santiago is taking back what belongs to him because that family lives on controlling and humiliating with money. And about the therapist, I wish you knew what real anxiety is and not the aesthetic anxiety you use for memes. I'm surviving emotional sabotage, and if you find it funny, you're part of the problem, not the debate. Update 2. A week has passed since the last update, and although it sounds absurd, it was the most productive week I've had in months, because at least I was breathing like a normal person again. I know the thing with the watches sounds scandalous when told in cold blood, but in the heat of the moment it felt like the only way not to die of shame. Santiago kept going to that miserable job with the face of a beaten puppy, and I kept feeling like my life was shrinking like badly washed clothes. So when we finally managed to sell one, I felt a jolt of relief so strong I almost got dizzy with happiness. It wasn't just money, it was the feeling that I could still twist fate. We sold the watch in a place that smelled of old wood and people who know how to negotiate without batting an eye. Santiago was trembling, looking at the floor, acting as if the watch were one of his organs, and I had to be the one to speak firmly. I'm not proud of having to push a man, but someone had to have a spine at that moment. When they gave us the money, Santiago wanted to save it as if it were a relic, as if the paper could disappear in the wind. I told him the first thing was to get myself back together, because I was at a point where anything could set me off. He agreed because deep down he knows that if I break, he breaks too, and he's terrified of being alone with his own incompetence. I proposed a weekend at a luxury spa, not on a whim, but because I needed to recover my body. You can't think about strategies with a tight stomach and your shoulders up to your neck. Santiago tried to say maybe it was better to save, and I looked at him with that patience that was already wearing thin. I reminded him that money is useless if the person managing it is trembling inside. I told him I needed silence, steam, a massage, and an environment that would give me back the feeling that I'm worth something. And yes, that's also medicine, even if it offends poor people. We arrived at the spa, and I finally felt like the world was back in its place. The walls smelled of expensive oils, the towels were thick, and the staff looks at you as if your existence is important. Santiago relaxed a little, because that's how he is. He calms down when he's treated like a rich kid, even if he wasn't at that moment. I put on the robe and felt an almost spiritual relief, as if the cotton were apologizing to me for all the previous stress. I ordered cucumber water. I asked for a sauna session, and for a few hours I managed to forget Dona Elena. I told myself that maybe life was finally giving us a truce. That night, at the hotel dinner, Santiago was weird, like hyper-alert, checking his phone every 2 minutes. I thought it was guilt, that it was fear, that it was his internal drama of I'm bad, even though his family is literally a system of control. I asked him to behave because we weren't going to ruin the only decent weekend we'd had in a long time. He promised me he was fine, just tired, that he'd be better tomorrow. I wanted to believe him because sometimes you choose to believe to survive. I went to bed thinking the steam would clear my head, and I fell asleep with that silly smile of someone who feels protected. Again. The next morning, I was in the thermal pool with my hair up, feeling almost elegant when I felt it before I saw it. It's hard to explain this without sounding exaggerated, but there are presences that change your body temperature. I saw Santiago coming towards me with a white face, as if he'd seen a ghost, and, before he opened his mouth I knew something had gone wrong. He told me he had received a call from the hotel, that there was an issue with the reservation, that they wanted to talk to us. I laughed because my brain wouldn't accept another catastrophe in such a beautiful place. I told him it was probably a system error. Santiago didn't laugh. They summoned us to the lobby, and there I saw Dona Elena as if she owned the air. She didn't arrive with yelling or police. She arrived calmly, with an impeccable coat and the hotel manager by her side as if they were lifelong friends. That was the part that broke me because it wasn't just an angry mother, it was a woman with a network, with social power, with tentacles. The manager treated her with reverence, and I understood that in that world, shame is scheduled like an event. Dona Elena didn't even look at us first. She looked at the lobby, at the people, and then she looked at us as if we were a stain. I felt the spa turn into a stage, and I was the joke of the day. What happened next was a swift and perfectly calculated blow. The manager said the reservation was cancelled, that there were breaches, that we had to leave. Dona Elena smiled faintly, like someone signing off on a punishment without getting her hands dirty. I tried to speak because I don't stay silent when they try to crush me, but the manager cut me off with that customer service voice that's politeness laced with venom. Santiago, instead of stepping up, stayed behind with watery eyes, clutching his robe as if it were a shield. I looked at him, waiting for him to say something, to at least defend my dignity, and all he did was shrink. They practically kicked us out, and the humiliation was worse because we were in bathrobes. People stared at us as if we were a dysfunctional couple, as if we were walking gossip. And I felt my skin burn. I wanted to cover myself, I wanted to disappear, I wanted the floor to swallow me, but I also wanted to break something. Dona Elena didn't raise her voice once. She didn't need to. She controls with the same tranquility that other women control with tears. And that's when I understood that I was playing chess with someone who invented the board. Santiago started crying right in the reception. Really crying with that cry of a child who's been caught. He approached his mother and apologized. He said, "Mommy," as if he were 5 years old, and I felt a mix of disgust and panic. Disgust because how embarrassing for a man to be like that. Panic because if he's like that with her, I don't exist in that hierarchy. I'm an accessory she can remove. I tried to tell Santiago to calm down, to stop humiliating us further, but he was in total submission mode. And while he was falling apart, I felt my future was falling apart too. Donna Elena finally looked at me with that look of a woman who believes she's doing hygiene. She told me with perfect coldness that if I wanted to live off her son, I had to work for him. She didn't say it as an insult, she said it as a decree, as if it were the logical conclusion of my existence. I felt the blood rush to my face because it's one thing to be criticized on the internet and another to have it said to you like that, with people around, with the manager watching, with guests listening. My first impulse was to respond with the same cruelty, but I bit my tongue because at that moment I had nothing in my hand, no card, no hotel, no control, just a bathrobe and a rage that was useless for paying for anything. She then offered the deal with that "I'm helping" voice. She said she would pay the debts, that she would cover whatever was necessary, but under one condition: I would accept being Santiago's personal assistant under her strict supervision. She sold it as an opportunity, as a learning experience, as a way to integrate myself and earn what I receive. I listened and boiled inside, because what she was describing was servitude with a pretty uniform. The worst part is that the deal wasn't just to control me, it was to humiliate me where it hurts most, my image. She wanted me to stop being a girlfriend and become a tool. Santiago lifted his head and looked at me as if asking me to save him from his mother, as always. That was the cruel twist, because I realized he wasn't going to decide anything. He was just going to accept whatever she said, and I had to choose between two shames, leaving with nothing or staying and paying the price with my time. I thought about Mateo for a second, not out of nostalgia, but out of terror of returning to that life of counting coins. I thought about my clothes, my routines, about what it had cost me to feel like I belonged to another level, and I felt something very ugly. Pride turned into a cage. I accepted in that moment, not with a smile, but with my head held high, or at least I tried. I told her I wasn't afraid of work, that I could prove my worth if necessary. I said it like that because I wasn't going to give her the pleasure of seeing me beg. Donna Elena nodded as if I had passed a test, and the manager relaxed as if a transaction had been completed. They let us go back to the room just to get our things, which is a cruelty because they make you walk through the halls feeling expelled. I packed my clothes with trembling hands, not from guilt, but from rage. And as we went down to the lobby with our suitcases, I understood the real threat. Donna Elena no longer just controlled the money, now she was going to control my daily life. On the way back, Santiago was quiet, destroyed, as if he were the main victim, and that infuriated me. I wanted to scream at him that he had caused all of this by not having character, by not going to a birthday, by not being an independent man. But I didn't, because at that point I needed him to at least continue being my ticket into that world. He told me his mother just wanted to help us, and I felt like laughing at how pathetic that sounds. Help us by kicking us out in bathrobes in front of everyone. Right. I told him that from now on, if I was going to enter that house as an assistant, he was going to have to obey me, at least in private. He didn't answer, and that lack of response was worse than a no. The immediate consequence was that same night Donna Elena sent me a message with cold instructions, as if I were already part of her inventory. She asked for my documents, my schedule, my availability, and made it clear that money is managed with discipline. Santiago, meanwhile, received a minimal transfer to survive as a reward for behaving, and he looked at me as if that were hope. I looked at him and knew we were entering a worse phase. It was no longer a fight over a credit card, it was a war for domestic control. And the most dangerous part was realizing that I had agreed to enter my enemy's house out of necessity. That's the kind of decision that changes you forever, and I felt it like a knot that wouldn't come undone. Comments from Update 2. Anonymous User 1 says, "You got kicked out of the spa in a bathrobe for selling a stolen watch with a GPS, and you still act dignified saying you accepted with your head held high. You're not a victim of Donna Elena, you're the consequence of your own decisions." OP's reply. You people are so comfortable when you think life is a straight line of cause and effect, as if the powerful don't manipulate everything in their favor. The GPS wasn't my fault. I didn't make the watch or put the tracker in it. And if a mother uses her connections to humiliate her son and me in public, that's abuse, even if it's hard for you to see. I accepted the deal because I'm smart and I know how to survive, not because I like being dominated. Sometimes dignity isn't shouting, it's staying on the board so you don't lose completely. Anonymous user I says, the best part is Santiago crying and calling her mommy disgusted you, but you're still stuck to him because he's your ticket. So, you despise the child, but you want his piggy bank. And now you're going to be his servant by choice. OP's reply. I don't choose this for pleasure, I choose it because I'm not going back to a life of scarcity just so you can applaud my supposed morality. And yes, it makes me angry that Santiago is weak, but that doesn't mean I deserve to be punished by a mother who controls with money and humiliation. You talk about a servant as if work were shameful, but what's shameful is that a woman has to swallow this to not end up on the street. I'm doing what's necessary to stay afloat, even if you all love to see me sink. Update 3. 2 years have passed since the last update, and if someone had told me in that lobby, in a bathrobe with my face hot with shame, that this was going to be my life, I would have spat with laughter. I accepted the deal because I had nowhere to go and because I refused to go back to poverty. Simple as that. It wasn't romanticism or a learning experience, it was survival with perfect nails. The irony is that now I live in the mansion. Yes. But I live like a piece of furniture that moves when fingers are snapped. And the worst part is that over time you get used to the unbearable, and that's what scares me most about myself. The first month was a brutal shock because I came in thinking personal assistant sounded elegant like in a movie. Dona Elena made sure there was no confusion. My job was to take care of Santiago as if he were a baby in an expensive suit. I had to wake him up, make sure he didn't fall back asleep, remind him of appointments, check that he showered, choose his clothes, and even make sure he ate. At first, Santiago played at feeling important, as if having an assistant were a prize, and I had to swallow it. I'd tell him with a tight smile that it was all for his own good, because otherwise Dona Elena would come down on me with her notebook of errors. That woman turned my life into an emotional audit. Santiago didn't mature, he got worse, because now he had permission to be useless. If before he at least had the shame of being dependent, now he was comfortably dependent because I absorbed his chaos. He'd wake up late and blame me for not insisting more. He'd dress badly and say I picked the wrong shirt. He'd forget a meeting and look at me as if I had hidden the calendar. I quickly understood that my job wasn't to help him, it was to be a sounding board so he would never feel real consequences. Dona Elena implemented rules that seemed like they were from a boarding school. There were schedules, task lists, reports, and a way of speaking to me that always reminded me I was there by opportunity, not by right. If I complained, she'd tell me the world doesn't give anything away for free. If I asked for a break, she called it a lack of discipline. If I tried to have a life of my own, she interpreted it as ingratitude, and in any discussion the same thing always floated in the air. She pays, she calls the shots. It's not that she yelled at me, she doesn't even need to yell. Her control is silent, but it weighs like a tombstone. The most humiliating part was the salary, because I thought I'd at least have minimal independence. Dona Elena deposited it, yes, but she controlled it as if it were a conditioned tip. If Santiago made mistakes, they'd dock my pay. If Santiago threw a tantrum, they'd dock my pay. If Santiago was late, they'd dock my pay, because someone had to prevent it. At first I exploded. I said it was unfair, that I wasn't responsible for a grown man. Dona Elena looked at me with that scary calm and told me that if I wanted to live under her roof, I had to accept her system. And that's when I learned that injustice can also be legal inside a rich person's house. Over time, the job became a suffocating routine. I'd wake up before everyone else, because if Santiago woke up in a bad mood, the day would become a hell. I'd prepare his clothes, organize his schedule, remind him of basic things, and I had to use an exact tone so he wouldn't get sensitive. If I was sweet, he became whimsical. If I was firm, he got offended and made a scene. If I ignored him, he'd throw himself into an emotional void, so I would chase after him. It was like taking care of someone who learned to use fragility as a weapon. And yes, I lived in a mansion, but my life was small. I saw huge rooms that weren't mine, gardens I didn't enjoy, and I ate expensive food without tasting it because I was always thinking about Santiago's next crisis. My friends at first told me I was lucky, that I was living better than anyone, that they were envious. I didn't explain everything to them because there are humiliations you don't share, and because nobody understands what it's like to be trapped in a beautiful place that feels like a prison. Sometimes I'd look in the mirror and have trouble recognizing myself, not because of the uniform, but because of the way I had learned to speak softly. Santiago, for his part, became an expert in adult tantrums. If Dona Elena denied him something, he'd lock himself in his room and say nobody loves him. If I asked him to take responsibility, he'd tell me I was pressuring him and start crying as if I were the bad guy. I learned to anticipate his crying because crying is currency in that house. When he cries, Dona Elena softens a little. And when Dona Elena softens, I can breathe. That's how sick it all became. Me, managing a man's tears so his mother wouldn't punish me. There were moments when I thought about leaving, but the same wall always appeared. Leave to where? I had no real savings because the deductions ate them up and my pride wouldn't let me go back to a life of scarcity. Besides, leaving that house wasn't just moving out, it was admitting that I failed. And I'm not the kind of person who swallows defeat with a smile. I preferred to endure, to plan, to wait for a twist, even if the twist never came. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that one day Dona Elena would get tired, that one day Santiago would grow up, that one day I would regain control. 2 years later, I'm still telling myself that, and that says a lot. The cruelest part is that from the outside people think I won. I live in a mansion, I have food, I have a roof, I have a last name around me, and nobody sees that I'm the one running after a man so his pants don't fall down. Nobody sees that my schedule is decided by Dona Elena, that my breaks depend on Santiago's mood, that my salary is a punishment mechanism. Nobody sees that every day I wake up with the feeling that I'm taking care of someone who wouldn't even get me a glass of water. And despite everything, I kept trying to convince myself that at least I wasn't back in poverty. Yesterday, what happened honestly finished splitting my reality in two. Dona Elena announced they were going to remodel the West Wing as if it were just any old project, and I took it as rich people noise. I was organizing Santiago's morning, putting a blazer on him that he hated, reminding him of an appointment he didn't want to go to, and I heard voices in the hallway. I went out with my folder in hand, in my impeccable assistant uniform, and I saw a group of people with blueprints walk in. Among them was Mateo. Mateo, my ex, the good guy, the one I left for not giving me the life I deserve. The blow was physical, as if my chest had been shoved. Mateo was taller, more confident, with a different presence, like someone who knows their worth without having to prove it with brands. They introduced him as the head architect, and he started giving orders to his team with a firm calm. He didn't shout, he didn't show off, he just directed, and that authority came naturally to him. I stood still, trying not to let my face betray anything, but inside I was on fire. The universe has a cruel sense of humor when it wants to. Mateo saw me, and for a second his face changed, not with anger, but with pity. That kind of pity is worse than any insult, because it puts you in a small place. He greeted me politely, as if I were a distant acquaintance, as if my presence there were an unavoidable sadness. I wanted to say something to disarm him, something to give me back my power, but the words didn't come out the way I wanted, because it's one thing to be strong on the internet and another to be in a uniform in front of someone who's now in charge on your stage. And the worst part was seeing that he didn't need to keep looking at me to win. He simply continued with his work. I watched him walk through the mansion, pointing at walls, talking about structures, changes, expansion, and I felt ridiculous. I left the worker because I thought he'd never be more than effort and tacos, and now he was there designing luxury, giving orders, and being respected by a rich family. Meanwhile, I was behind Santiago, a big kid, adjusting his clothes so he wouldn't throw a tantrum. It was as if life had forced me to look at my own decision from a camera with zoom. And yes, I get the lesson everyone would want to draw from this, but I'm not going to say it the way they want to hear it. Santiago, of course, didn't even understand the magnitude of the moment. He just asked me why I was acting weird. And when I told him Mateo was my ex, he got childishly jealous. He said he didn't want me to talk to him, that he didn't want me to look at him, that he was the man of my life. I had to take a deep breath not to explode, because it's grotesque for a kept man to get possessive as if he were a king. Donna Elena observed everything from afar, with that look of someone who enjoys the chessboard, and I felt that she understood the joke too. She didn't say anything, but her silence was a laugh. Today I woke up with the same routine, the same uniform, the same folder, but with a new humiliation installed in my throat. Mateo will be coming to the mansion for weeks for the renovation, walking the halls like a boss, looking at me like I'm a charity case. And I'll continue waking Santiago up, putting up with his bad mood, managing his appointments, and watching as Donna Elena docks my pay for mistakes that aren't mine. The immediate consequence is that now I'm not just trapped, now I'm trapped with an audience. And even though I don't say it out loud, because I'm not going to give that victory to anyone, I know that fate is charging me with interest. Comments from Update 3. Anonymous User 1 says, 2 years of your deal, and you ended up as a nanny for an adult with pay deductions if Santiago misbehaves. And the punchline, Mateo is now the head architect and saw you in your uniform. Life wrote a thesis on you. OP's reply. How funny you find it, because you're not the one living with a controlling mother breathing down your neck and an immature man hanging off your arm. I'm not a nanny, I'm an assistant. And if the deduction system is unfair, it's because that house operates like a company, not a family. The thing with Mateo isn't a punchline, it's a cruel coincidence that anyone could experience if the universe gets whimsical. But of course, you turn other people's pain into a joke to feel superior from your couch. Anonymous User 2 says, the funniest thing is that you left Mateo for economic violence, and now you literally work in the mansion in a uniform for the useless millionaire's son. You didn't even get the luxury, you got the job. OP's reply, it makes you laugh because you only understand life as punishment and cheap morals, as if everything were a fable. I didn't get the job. I got a roof over my head, access, opportunities that you don't see because you only look at the uniform as a symbol. Besides, Mateo isn't a saint or a martyr, and the fact that he's doing well today doesn't mean my decision at the time was absurd. If you want to reduce my story to a karma joke, go ahead. But I know what I survived and what I'm still putting up with. Not everyone could endure that.